The snow had stopped falling only an hour earlier, leaving the canvas tents glistening under a pale winter sky. It was January 1945, somewhere on the western edge of the Rhineland, where the sounds of artillery had faded into a distant rumble. Inside a makeshift field hospital, the air carried a mixture of carbolic acid, cold metal, and the quiet murmur of exhausted nurses moving between cots. Most of them were German, captured along with the remnants of their medical unit when the front collapsed days earlier. They had treated wounded men in bombed-out farmhouses and collapsing bunkers, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to witness. A group of American medics pushed through the flap, soaked in mud, dragging stretchers overloaded with wounded. Not just their own. Half the men wore tattered Feldgrau tunics. Some still had Wehrmacht insignia barely clinging to their sleeves, stiff with dried blood. Yet the Americans didn't separate them, didn't shout orders or demand prioritization based on uniform. They simply moved quickly and methodically, as if every life weighed exactly the same. One German nurse paused, starring as an American medic knelt beside a gravely injured German corporal and immediately opened a plasma kit. She whispered to the colleague beside her, "Warm, behandeln Sie ein Zweist." And the answer, she soon learned, would challenge everything she had been taught, leading into a far deeper understanding of the war unfolding around her. The cold never truly left the tents that winter, and neither did the weight of a war entering its final, chaotic stage. To understand why those German nurses froze in disbelief at what they witnessed, the world around them needs to be seen as it truly was in early 1945. Germany was fighting on collapsing fronts, its armies battered and retreating, its medical corps stretched far beyond its breaking point. Supply lines had crumbled months earlier. Fuel, bandages, morphine, and even clean water were becoming luxuries. Field hospitals often operated in ruins, basements, or commandeered barns, lit by flickering lanterns and warmed only by the breath of the wounded. The contrast could not have been sharper on the Western Front. Since the Normandy landings in June 1944, American medical units had moved forward at an astonishing speed, establishing aid stations, clearing stations, evacuation hospitals, and surgical units in a chain that, though strained, still functioned with remarkable efficiency. Their doctrine emphasized rapid evacuation. A wounded soldier, friend or enemy, was to be stabilized, treated, and transported without delay. Every minute saved meant a life saved. It was a system built not only on resources but on planning, logistics, and a mindset that viewed medical care as a strategic weapon. Keep men alive, and the army stays strong. Germany had entered the war with a competent, even advanced medical system by 1939 standards. But by 1944-45, the situation had changed drastically. Years of attritional battles in the east, aerial bombardment at home, and the sheer scale of casualties had consumed everything. Trains carrying medical supplies were bombed before reaching their destinations. Many hospitals had been reduced to shells of brick and dust under Allied air raids. Nurses were overworked, doctors drafted into combat roles, and young replacements arrived with minimal training. Under such conditions, care often meant improvisation, using torn shirts for bandages, boiling instruments in tin cups, or performing surgery with only a few grams of anesthetic left. And yet, despite the misery, German medical personnel maintained strict triage rules. Their priority was simple: treat German soldiers first, then allies, then, if time and material remained, enemy prisoners. In many sectors, especially where SS oversight existed, enemy wounded were often left unattended until all German casualties had been stabilized. Some German nurses had never even seen a captured Allied soldier receive proper treatment. Not because they didn't want to care for them, but because the war had conditioned them. Resources were too scarce, orders were too clear, survival was too uncertain. That was the world they carried with them when American forces overran their sector. For the Americans, the situation looked different. Their medical system was built on mobility, redundancy, and overwhelming supply. Even under fire, even in the freezing forests of the Ardennes, units carried plasma, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, and portable surgical kits. They trained relentlessly on the belief that the wounded must be evacuated within hours, not days. And crucially, American doctrine, reinforced by the 1929 Geneva Convention, stated that all wounded, including enemy prisoners, must receive equal care. By the final year of the war, this principle had become almost instinctive among U.S. Army medics. Many of them had grown up in a society where the war was fought far from home, where industrial strength was a symbol of national power, and where humanitarian ideals still circulated in newspapers and radio speeches. Their medical officers taught them that a wounded man was simply a patient, regardless of the uniform he wore. This attitude created moments on the battlefield that seemed unreal to German medical staff. There were documented cases where American medics crawled under fire to rescue wounded Germans because they were the nearest casualties. In some areas, American field hospitals recorded days where more German POWs received stitches, transfusions, and emergency surgery than American troops. It wasn't sentimentality. It was procedure, backed by supply stocks that Germany could only dream of. So when those German nurses were brought to the American field hospital as POWs or as captured medical personnel expected to assist, they stepped into a world where the rules were different. They saw blood plasma administered to enemy soldiers within minutes of arrival. They saw German wounded rushed into operating tents alongside American men. They saw a system functioning despite the chaos, a system that treated war as tragedy rather than hierarchy. And as they observed this strange environment, this place where uniform color no longer dictated who lived or died, they began to question the assumptions they had held since the war's earliest days. That moment of doubt, the subtle shift in their understanding, marked the beginning of a deeper story about humanity, ideology, and the unexpected ways compassion surfaced even in the final, brutal year of the conflict, leading naturally into a broader understanding of how the larger war shaped everything they witnessed inside that tent. American medical doctrine in the Second World War was built on a foundation that Germany could no longer match by 1945. The U.S. entered the conflict with vast industrial capacity, and by the middle of the war it had refined a medical evacuation chain unlike anything Europe had seen. Aid men were trained to reach wounded soldiers within minutes. Battalion aid stations stabilized them. Collecting companies moved them to clearing stations. Surgical teams operated in mobile hospitals that could be erected in a matter of hours. From there, evacuation hospitals and hospital trains carried the injured back toward France, Belgium, or England. Each step had its own staff, its own equipment, and most importantly, its own supply line. To German nurses arriving as prisoners or detainees, this system felt almost surreal. Only months earlier, many of them had worked in field hospitals that had been forced to relocate every few days, dragging wounded men across muddy roads or abandoning facilities under shell fire. Some had run out of sterile dressings entirely, resorting to cutting sheets into strips or washing and reusing bandages until the fabric fell apart. When American medics opened crates filled with fresh gauze, plasma bottles, surgical tools, morphine, penicillin, and sulfa drugs, the sight alone was almost unbelievable. What impressed them even more was the speed. American units had learned, through the lessons of North Africa and Normandy, that survival depended on compressing time. A man who reached surgery within an hour had a remarkably higher chance of living than one who waited until nightfall. The result was a culture where the wounded were moved constantly, almost mechanically, from one level of care to the next. German nurses, accustomed to static hospitals overwhelmed by immobile casualties, watched this flow with a mixture of admiration and confusion. It was as though the Americans had turned medicine into logistics, where saving lives depended as much on trucks and organization as on skill. But there was another layer beneath this efficiency. American medics were instructed repeatedly that humanitarian treatment of enemy wounded protected American prisoners as well. If the U.S. gained a reputation for treating German soldiers fairly and with dignity, then German officers might be more inclined to spare American captives on the other side of the front. In a war defined by unprecedented brutality on the Eastern Front, the Western Allies maintained a strict commitment to the Geneva Convention. This wasn't simply ethics. It was strategy shaped by global politics, diplomacy, and the desire to set a post-war standard. German nurses, many raised under a system that emphasized loyalty to the Reich above all else, had been taught that the enemy was the cause of their suffering, the destroyer of their cities, the threat to their families. In their hospitals, some enemy soldiers had been treated respectfully, but always with the knowledge that they came last. Now they stood in wards where American doctors treated a wounded German grenadier ahead of an American infantryman because his condition was more critical. That simple reversal, treat the most urgent case, not the most favored uniform, was shocking. The Americans also had something else rare in late-war Europe: mobility without desperation. While German medical units retreated under constant pressure, U.S. medical forces advanced behind divisions that, despite suffering heavy losses, still had reliable food, fuel, and reinforcements. German nurses were used to hearing orders shouted in panic, vehicles running dry, wounded begging for evacuation that never came. In the American hospital complex, procedures replaced panic. Even under artillery threat, the work continued with a kind of steady discipline. Some of the German nurses noticed something that felt even more jarring: the behavior of young American medics. Many of these men were barely out of civilian life: farm boys, factory workers, students. They greeted wounded POWs with the same tone they used with their own troops. They cracked small remarks to calm patients, wrapped blankets around shivering prisoners, and spoke with a gentleness that contrasted with the hardened numbness common among German staff who had served since the early years of the war. It wasn't that American medics didn't fear or resent the enemy. Many had lost friends on the battlefield, but their training left little room for hesitation. A casualty was a casualty. Word of this approach spread quickly among captured German medical staff. Some denied what they saw at first. Some believed it was propaganda for show. Others watched closely and found there was no deception. The Americans simply operated by different rules, shaped by a different world, a different distance from the destruction, and a different understanding of duty. As the nurses observed day after day, their perspective shifted from disbelief to a quiet recognition that the methods around them reflected not just resources but a fundamentally different philosophy of war. The realization that would shape every moment they remembered from that winter, carrying them toward the deeper human angles of the story that emerged inside those crowded, cold tents. They began noticing the human differences first. In the dim light of kerosene lamps, where the wounded lay in rows, German nurses watched how American medics spoke to the men on their stretchers. They didn't bark orders or hurry with clipped impatience. They knelt close, asked simple questions, reassured a man even if they didn't know his language. A wounded German who struggled to breathe might feel a hand on his shoulder and hear slow, steady English he couldn't fully understand, but he recognized the tone. It was the tone a person used when trying to keep another alive. Many of the German nurses had seen years of combat trauma. They had witnessed surgeons work with brutal efficiency, and they themselves had grown thick-skinned to survive the strain. But the Americans brought something unfamiliar, a kind of emotional steadiness, a clear attempt to calm fear rather than ignore it. For nurses who had spent years in a collapsing system, this quiet human presence felt almost foreign. The tactical angle was just as striking. The U.S. Army understood that caring for wounded, even enemy wounded, had direct military value. Soldiers who trusted their medics fought with more confidence. Commanders who knew casualty evacuation functioned smoothly could take risks. and every wounded German treated in American hospitals was one more person who could provide intelligence, willingly or not, once stabilized. Saving lives was not only moral, it was practical. German nurses, coming from a doctrine that prioritized national strength over individual welfare, were surprised to see that efficiency and empathy worked together rather than against each other. They realized that the American approach strengthened the army in a way they had not expected, removing fear from the minds of frontline troops who knew that if they fell, someone would come for them. Leadership also played a decisive role. Eisenhower and SHAEF insisted on strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, and this filtered down through layers of command. American officers expected their medical units to operate with a professionalism that reflected not just military discipline, but America's self-image during the war. Statements reminding units to treat enemy wounded without discrimination were common. For German nurses used to directives shaped by ideology, many issued with uncompromising language. This emphasis on neutrality felt almost strange. It showed them a leadership style built on regulation rather than rhetoric, on stability rather than emotional appeals. But the angle that struck them most deeply, the one they struggled to explain to each other during quiet moments, was the moral atmosphere inside the American medical tents. These were places where hatred had little room to grow. The war continued outside, violent as ever, but inside the tent, there was a boundary that even the young American soldiers respected. One nurse remarked to another that it felt like entering a different world, where the war was something happening elsewhere, not in the room with them. They watched American medics clean wounds on German prisoners with the same care given to U.S. soldiers. They heard no mockery, no gloating, no punishment disguised as medical procedure. For many of them, this was the first time they had seen the enemy behave not as an occupier, not as a destroyer, but simply as professionals committed to their role. And yet beneath the surface, some of the German nurses wondered if this morality was partly due to distance. The Americans had not watched their cities burn night after night. They had not lost entire neighborhoods to firestorms. They had not seen invasion or famine. Perhaps they could afford to show compassion. Perhaps their conscience was not burdened by the desperation that weighed on German shoulders in those final months. This question lingered silently as they worked, neither fully accepted nor dismissed. Still, they couldn't deny that the environment changed them. Every day they spent inside that tent peeled away one layer of the assumptions they had carried into the war. They saw the enemy not as an image drawn in propaganda posters, but as young men exhausted by the same brutality. They saw American medics treating the wounded not because they were allies or enemies, but because they were wounded. It was a perspective that challenged them quietly, steadily, moment by moment. And as these realizations sank in, the nurses found themselves paying closer attention, unsure whether they were witnessing a strategy, a cultural difference, or something more deeply human. An uncertainty that would become even more pronounced when they confronted the technological and logistical differences that shaped the treatment of the wounded around them. They noticed the technology next, often in small moments. A plasma bottle hanging from a metal stand, a medic checking a patient's pulse while adjusting the drip, a surgical lamp powered by a portable generator humming steadily through the night. These were things German nurses had seen earlier in the war but had rarely encountered in the final year. Plasma, in particular, stood out. American units carried it almost everywhere, packed in insulated containers, ready to use within minutes. German forces relied far more on whole blood, which was harder to transport and almost impossible to guarantee at the front once the infrastructure began collapsing. Watching an American medic prepare plasma for a German prisoner felt to many nurses like witnessing a small miracle. The corporal who received it might have died in any German aid station that winter, simply because nothing was available. Here, he stabilized within an hour. Evacuation trucks added to the shock. American GMC ambulances moved continuously, day and night, collecting the wounded from battalion stations and carrying them rearward. They had heat, a luxury, and stretcher racks designed for efficiency. German nurses who had spent months loading wounded onto wagons, farm carts, or whatever vehicle still had fuel looked at these ambulances as symbols of an entirely different kind of war. The Americans were fighting with machines and planning. Germany, by 1945, was fighting with whatever could be scavenged. Beyond the equipment, something else drew their attention: the organization of the American medical teams. The nurses saw young medics train not only for combat first aid but for minor surgical procedures, wound management, and shock treatment. They had drilled repeatedly on how to stop bleeding, open airways, administer morphine safely, and move casualties without worsening injuries. German medical orderlies were often brave and dedicated, but many had been given only basic instruction before being thrown into chaotic battlefield conditions. The Americans were not more moral, the nurses realized. They were simply better prepared. But the enemy's perspective, the one held by German soldiers on the stretchers, revealed an even deeper angle. Many wounded Germans arrived terrified of how they would be treated. Propaganda had convinced some that Americans executed prisoners, mutilated the wounded, or let them die without care. When they were instead lifted gently, given water, treated with medicine they had never seen, or placed in warm tents, the shock was overwhelming. Some cried from relief, others apologized for assuming the worst. Nurses who overheard these exchanges felt a complicated mix of pride, shame, and confusion. For years they had been told they were defending Europe from brutality. Now they saw the enemy treating their men with a level of care Germany could no longer provide. Inside the tents, the moral angle took shape most clearly. American treatment of German wounded was not sentimental. It was clinical, rule-bound, almost routine. But that routine itself carried a moral weight. It showed an understanding that war was destructive enough without adding cruelty. It offered a glimpse of how a society far from the front viewed the conflict, as something fought by soldiers, not as a total struggle in which every enemy life was expendable. German nurses, who had lived under propaganda that portrayed the enemy in monstrous terms, watched American medics treat even badly wounded SS men without hesitation. It didn't erase the war's hatred, but it softened its edges inside the perimeter of the medical tents. Over time, the German nurses themselves were drawn into the work. American officers expected them to assist, and many did so willingly. They found themselves cooperating with medics who tried to speak broken German, sharing instruments, holding flashlights during surgery, or tending to wounds under supervision. In those moments, the lines between enemy and ally blurred, replaced by a shared commitment to the suffering human lying between them. It was not friendship. It was not reconciliation, but it was something rare, a temporary suspension of the war inside a small circle of light in the middle of a collapsing world. This cooperation deepened their understanding of the moral complexity surrounding them. They saw American medics who hated the German army but refused to harm a helpless man. They saw wounded Americans whisper, thanks to German nurses who helped dress their wounds. They saw German prisoners who had cursed the enemy now clinging to the hands of American orderlies. And through these moments, a truth formed quietly. Medical care had become a neutral space, a place where survival mattered more than ideology, where procedures had the power to soften even the hardest perceptions. Yet all these angles, the human, tactical, technological, moral, were preparing the nurses for the moment when everything they had seen would converge into a single, unforgettable scene. A moment when the war itself forced a clarity that none of them had expected, and the pressures of battle pushed the American medical system, the German wounded, and the captured nurses into the same crucible. The turning point arrived not with a dramatic announcement, but with the deep, rolling thunder of artillery somewhere to the east. It was early March 1945, a time when the German front was unraveling faster than anyone could track. American divisions pushed toward the Rhine, and pockets of resistance collapsed under the weight of encirclement. One such pocket, tired, battered, and nearly out of ammunition, sent its wounded staggering westward, hopping to reach any shelter before the fighting swallowed them. Many didn't make it. Those who did arrived in waves, some carried by desperate comrades, others limping alone, bleeding through makeshift bandages torn from uniforms. American medics had been warned to expect casualties, but no one anticipated the volume. Trucks rumbled into the hospital perimeter with stretchers stacked too high. Nurses and orderlies rushed forward, trying to count the wounded as fast as they appeared. Among them were German nurses who had been assisting in quiet, steady rhythms for days. Now they were thrown into the chaos alongside the Americans, their hands suddenly needed, their experience suddenly vital. Inside the main treatment tent, the air turned thick with heat and urgency. Plasma bottles hung in clusters, lamps flickered under the strain of the generator. A surgeon barked instructions, short, sharp, focused, trying to manage more critical cases than his team could reasonably handle. German nurses moved as quickly as they could, passing instruments, clearing space, lifting stretchers. For the first time since their capture, they were not just observing the American system. They were inside it, part of it, holding it together as the wounded kept coming. Then the moment happened. A group of American medics burst through the entrance carrying 3 soldiers, 1 American, 2 German. All were barely conscious. All were bleeding heavily. All needed immediate intervention. The medics laid them down, shouting condition reports. One of the German soldiers, a young private no older than 19, was ghost pale, his pulse thread-like. The American was badly wounded too, shrapnel through the abdomen, shallow breathing, fatting fast. The lead American surgeon pointed directly at the German private and said, "He goes first. He won't last 10 minutes without surgery." A silence fell over the German nurses. Even some of the American orderlies hesitated, glancing at the wounded American on the adjacent stretcher. But the surgeon was unmoved. He had already seen enough dying men to know which had the smallest window. For him, choice had no uniform. It was simply math, blood, and time. He gestured again, firm, urgent, "Prep him now." German nurses exchanged looks. Disbelief, confusion, even concern for how the Americans might react. But the medics did not question their officer. One immediately set to work stabilizing the wounded American as best he could, knowing the second operating table would be ready soon. The others prepared the German private for surgery, cleaning the wound, checking his airway, adjusting plasma flow. One German nurse, her hands trembling slightly, leaned over the boy's face. She recognized him by his division patch, an exhausted fragment of a unit that had fought for weeks without relief. She had treated men like him under artillery fire, using whatever she could scavenge. Now she watched an American surgeon shouting for more clamps and sutures to save him. It felt impossible. Minutes later, another group of medics rushed in with more casualties. This time there were more Americans. Some were unconscious, some writhing, some begging for help. Yet the previous decision held, triage based on need, not nationality. The Americans stabilized their own wounded, but the operating table did not change order. The German boy was still under the knife. At that moment, something shifted in the minds of the German nurses. They had seen Americans treat German wounded before, but never under this kind of pressure, never at the cost of delaying treatment for one of their own. Here, in the chaos of battle, stripped of ceremony and calm, the American system revealed its core principle. Whether motivated by discipline, doctrine, or a belief in medical neutrality, it left no room for favoritism. One nurse whispered to another, "They treat by urgency, not by uniform." The other nurse nodded slowly, trying to reconcile what she saw with everything she had known since the war began. Around them, the tent remained a storm of movement. Syringes passed hand to hand, blood pooling on sheets, medics shouting for help, surgeons working faster than seemed humanly possible. But beneath the noise, the message was unmistakable. The Americans were following rules that did not change, even when the cost was personal. Even when their own men were bleeding on nearby stretchers. even when saving an enemy meant delaying a comrade's chance at survival. That realization stayed with the German nurses long after that night. It marked a point where the war they thought they understood shifted unexpectedly, revealing something they had never expected from the enemy they had been taught to fear. And as the night continued, the chaos only grew, leading toward an even more intense confrontation with the limits of the American system, and the emotional breaking point that came when the flood of casualties tested every rule and every belief inside that hospital. The storm of casualties did not slow. Word came in bursts, first from runners, then from radio calls, that the front had collapsed farther east than expected. What had begun as a steady retreat had turned into a full routing. Hundreds of German soldiers, many of them wounded, were streaming toward American lines, desperate to surrender before the next barrage fell. At the same time, American units engaged in pursuit were taking heavy losses from rearguard fire. The hospital, already strained, became the only functioning medical site within miles. Every available stretcher was occupied. Every table was full. The triage area spilled outside into the frigid night. The German nurses, who only days earlier had been outsiders inside the American medical system, were now essential. American officers gave them quick, clear instructions. They divided tasks, assigned stations, placed them with medics who needed extra hands. There was no time for hesitation. The war outside was collapsing so quickly that even established procedures strained under the weight of reality. Then came the worst moment of the night, an ambulance arriving overloaded beyond capacity. Inside were 7 wounded men. 3 were American. 4 were German prisoners who had been pulled from a collapsed building near the front. All 7 were in critical condition. 2 were unconscious. 1 American soldier was bleeding heavily from a chest wound, bubbles forming at the corner of his mouth with every shallow attempt to breathe. 1 German soldier had a mangled leg, the femoral artery torn, blood pooling rapidly beneath him. The medics unloaded them as fast as they could, but even from a distance it was clear. They wouldn't all survive without immediate intervention. The lead surgeon, still operating from the previous rush, shouted for triage to make the call. The responsibility fell to a young American captain who had been trained to evaluate, decide, and act within seconds. He knelt beside each man, checking pulses, wounds, responses, moving with a focus so sharp it seemed like instinct. The German nurses watched him closely, knowing the weight of his next words. He made the decision. The American with the chest wound was given priority 1, the German with the torn artery priority 2, the next American priority 3, and the remaining 4 listed in descending order of survivability. And again, the same principle emerged. The American with a better chance of stabilizing without surgery was moved aside so that the German bleeding out was treated next. Several medics flinched, not out of anger but out of fear for their own wounded, who were losing precious time. A German nurse near the triage line felt her breath catch. She had seen American kindness before, but not under stakes like these. These choices were being made under pressure so intense that survival itself felt like a coin toss. Yet the Americans stayed consistent. Urgency dictated action, not nationality, not affiliation. The tense interior became a storm of intensity. Surgeons switched tables with barely a word. Orderlies cleared blood-soaked linens and laid new ones with mechanical speed. Nurses, American and German, shared tools, passed clamps, tightened tourniquets, wiped sweat from surgeons' faces as the lamps grew hotter and the air thicker with the smell of sterilizer and iron. The emotional breaking point came when one of the American medics froze beside a stretcher. The wounded man was his friend. Their uniforms matched, their unit patches identical. The medic's hands shook as he hovered over him, unsure whether to plead, to intervene, or to accept the triage decision. For a moment, the strain of the night threatened to crack through the discipline that held the tent together. An older German nurse noticed. She stepped forward, placed a steadying hand on his arm, and quietly guided him toward the supplies he needed to stabilize his friend until surgery became available. Her touch wasn't sympathy. It was something more grounded, almost maternal. In that gesture, both of them realized they were working not as enemies, but as two exhausted medical staff fighting the same tide of human suffering. Around them, the wounded German whose condition had placed him second in priority was already on the table. The surgeon worked with relentless concentration. His gloves were slick with blood, his mask soaked with sweat. A young American medic held a retractor steady, knuckles white with strain. A German nurse kept the plasma flowing, adjusting the line every few minutes. No one spoke about enemy or ally. They spoke only of wound depth, blood pressure, breathing rate. The humanity of the scene overshadowed everything else. By dawn, the worst had passed. The German soldier with the torn artery survived. The American with the chest wound survived. Two others, one German, one American, did not. Their bodies lay covered outside the tent, awaiting burial details. When the sun rose, its light fell across a scene of exhaustion. Nurses slumped in chairs, medics leaned against crates, surgeons sat with their masks dangling around their necks, staring at the ground as if trying to process the night that had unfolded. In that silence, the German nurses felt a realization settle in their minds. They had witnessed something that no propaganda could have prepared them for. An enemy who treated their wounded with urgency equal to their own. A medical system that held to its principles even under unthinkable pressure. And a group of soldiers who, despite the hatred and destruction of war, refused to abandon their humanity in the face of suffering. They had stepped into the American medical world as captives, skeptics, and survivors. They emerged from that night as witnesses to an approach that challenged everything the war had taught them. And what followed, the slow settling of the front, the stabilization of the wounded, and the aftermath of that chaotic night, would leave an impression just as deep. With the sun climbing over the battered tree line, the world outside the medical tents felt strangely quiet. The artillery had faded into the distance, and the sounds that replaced it were softer, boots moving across frozen ground, stretchers being carried toward evacuation trucks, whispered conversations between exhausted staff. The hospital had survived the night. More importantly, so had many of the wounded who, under different circumstances, would have died hours earlier. For the German nurses, the aftermath brought a slow, dawning understanding of how deeply the American medical system differed from their own late-war reality. In German hospitals during those final months, survival often depended on luck, on whether the supply line still existed, whether the retreat allowed enough time for treatment, whether the building hadn't been hit by the next series of bombs. Here, though chaos had nearly overwhelmed the American staff, their structure had held. Supplies had arrived. Surgeons had worked in shifts. Medics had rotated between triage and stabilization without collapsing. And even in the darkest hours, the system had not broken. Some of the German nurses were escorted outside the tent to assist with the morning evacuation. They saw American ambulances lined up in rows, dozens of them. Each engine warmed, doors open, stretchers secured. Wounded American soldiers were loaded first, then wounded German prisoners, all bound for the same rear area hospitals. The nurses watched as American medics carefully documented each patient's injuries, plasma intake, medications administered, and emergency procedures performed. The paperwork alone was more detailed than many German field stations had managed in months. It ensured continuity, follow-up care, and survival far beyond the front line. Nearby, a small group of German prisoners, soldiers who had been stable enough to move, sat on blankets eating rations distributed by American orderlies. Several of the German nurses paused when they saw this. Food had been scarce on the German side for weeks. Many wounded had arrived at their own hospitals half-starved. Yet now, these same men ate warm calories while American soldiers carried coffee and water along the rows, checking on them, helping them sit up if they were too weak. There were rules, of course. Guards stood nearby. But the treatment remained consistent. Organization before hostility, procedure before prejudice. When the German nurses returned inside, they found the American surgeon, the same one who had insisted the critically wounded German be operated on first, sitting silently on a crate, elbows on his knees, staring at his blood-stained gloves. He looked less like a man reflecting on an act of compassion and more like someone calculating the toll of a night that had demanded too much. War weighed on him as heavily as on anyone else. And yet, his decisions had been governed by medical necessity, not emotion. One German nurse approached him timidly. Her uniform was still the faded gray of the Wehrmacht medical service, though she wore an American armband now. She asked, in hesitant English, how many would live. He answered with numbers. Calm, steady, factual. There was no pride in his voice, no self-congratulation. Only the clinical assessment of a man who measured success in survival rates, not in the identity of those he had treated. The nurse nodded, unsure how to respond. She realized that this neutrality, this steady adherence to principle, was something she had not seen in months. Not because German doctors lacked skill, but because their world had collapsed too far to sustain such detachment. Later that afternoon, American officers met with the captured German medical personnel. They explained that the nurses would continue assisting as long as they remained with the unit, though they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The Americans made no attempt to indoctrinate, no speeches about superiority or morality. They simply laid out rules, duties, rights, expectations. It was structure again, something the German nurses had lived with for years, but now delivered without the ideological weight that had accompanied so many of their former directives. Word soon spread that some of the German soldiers saved during the night had been stabilized enough for transport to long-term care facilities. A few of the nurses visited the recovery tent and saw the young German private, the boy who had been operated on first. He was pale but conscious, blinking slowly, surprised to be alive at all. An American medic checked his pulse with the same professional indifference he offered every patient. The boy whispered a faint thank you, his voice rasping in the cold air. The medic nodded once, recorded the chart and moved on. That small moment, the quiet gratitude of a German soldier lying in an American bed, alive because of a decision made without regard to uniform, remained etched in the memories of the nurses who witnessed it. Over the next days, the hospital continued to receive wounded from both sides, but the worst of the chaos had passed. News spread that American forces were nearing the Rhine in several sectors. German units were surrendering by the hundreds. The war, for those in the hospital, felt as though it were entering its final act. The German nurses began writing their first notes, brief reports that American officers permitted them to keep as part of their professional duties. Some wrote about the cases they assisted with. Others wrote about the equipment, the procedures, the discipline. A few wrote about the night when the hospital nearly collapsed under the weight of casualties and how the Americans had continued treating wounded Germans without hesitation. Unlike propaganda reports, these writings were not meant for public eyes. They were private, raw, and reflective, an attempt to capture a moment in history they did not yet fully understand. The nurses knew they would eventually be transferred to POW camps, then perhaps returned home if the war ended soon. But they also understood that the world they returned to would not resemble the one they left. Many had lost families, homes, and certainty. Yet the memory of that night, of American medics saving men they had been taught to hate, would travel with them into the uncertain future that awaited after Germany's surrender. And as the hospital tents gradually emptied, and the sounds of battle moved farther east, the emotional and moral weight of what they had witnessed settled into something quieter. A recognition that even in war, where brutality shaped every decision, humanity could still carve out a space where rules held, compassion mattered, and a wounded man was simply a patient. The evacuation trucks rumbled out one by one, carrying the last of the stabilized wounded toward rear area hospitals. The sun dipped low behind the treetops, turning the snow into a sheet of dull gold. For a moment, the camp felt almost peaceful, an illusion broken only by the distant hum of engines and the faint clatter of surgical trays being cleaned inside the tents. What remained now were fragments. The quiet aftershock of a night spent on the edge of collapse, the shifting understanding of what wartime medicine could look like, and the slow, unspoken reckoning unfolding within the German nurses who had witnessed it. They had served the Reich through years of steady decline, material shortages, bombings that never seemed to end, field hospitals packed with the dying, orders that changed by the hour as fronts crumbled. In those conditions, triage had become ruthless. Wounded who stood little chance were often set aside not out of cruelty but out of necessity. Resources had limits. Time had limits. Hope had limits. But within the American hospital, the nurses began to understand something profound. The power of logistics. The power of abundance. The power of a system still intact, still functioning, still capable of supporting humane treatment even in the worst moments of the war. American Medical Corps supply lines stretched back across the Atlantic, supported by a national industry untouched by bombing and strengthened by sheer production might. It meant plasma kits did not run out. It meant trucks arrived with morphine, sulfa, chloroform, oxygen tanks, blankets, fresh linens. It meant surgeons could fight for every life, German or American, because they did not have to ration compassion. This realization was not pleasant. For the German nurses, it carried a sting, not jealousy, something heavier. The awareness that the men they had treated back home could have survived if given these same resources, if given these same conditions, if their own nation had not been stretched past the breaking point. In quiet moments, they confided in one another. They spoke of hospital barracks bombed during air raids, of night shifts where lanterns dimmed because fuel had run out, of wounded men begging for water in the dark because the pumps had been destroyed. They looked around now, at the abundant supplies, at the orderlies moving with calm purpose, and felt a mixture of grief and revelation. One evening, as the cold deepened and the sky faded into violet, a senior American physician gathered the remaining medical staff, both American and German. He stood with a clipboard tucked under his arm, his voice low but clear. He reviewed the evacuation results, the survival percentages, the cases still awaiting stabilization. He thanked the German nurses for their cooperation, noting that several soldiers had survived because of their assistance during the worst hours of the night. It was not praise, it was acknowledgement, professional, precise. But the German nurses felt the weight of it. Recognition had been rare in their late war service. Suffering had overshadowed everything else. Later that night, 2 German nurses walked outside the tents, their breath turning to mist. They stood in silence, listening to the far-off thunder of war moving away from them. The horizon glowed faintly, distant fires burning along the retreating front. They both understood that soon they would be marched to a POW holding camp. Their work here was temporary, but the memory of what they had seen was permanent. At the edge of camp, they passed a small row of crosses marking graves. Some bore American names. A few had German names, carefully written by American medics on wooden planks. The nurses stopped at the German markers: fresh earth, clean lines, equal care. It unsettled something inside them. Not guilt, not comfort, something far more complex. A recognition that even in the bleakest months of the war, there existed pockets of humanity untouched by propaganda or hatred. The Americans had built one here, not perfect, not free of tension or fear, but grounded in rules that did not bend with emotion. As another day passed, the nurses were formally processed as POWs. Their uniforms were taken, replaced with simple coats marked with stenciled letters. Yet the respect they received was steady, almost routine. It was clear that for the Americans, these women were not enemies. They were medical personnel caught in a collapsing front. Before departure, they were permitted one final walk through the now quiet hospital grounds. The tents still stood, though most were half empty. Some American medics rested on stretchers, asleep where they sat. A surgeon washed his hands in icy water, his movements slow with exhaustion. The camp looked worn, battered, but functioning. One nurse paused at the doorway of the surgical tent. She looked at the space where the young German private had been saved, where blood had soaked the floor, where American hands had moved with speed and precision. She whispered something almost too soft to hear, an acknowledgement not of victory or defeat, but of the strange grace found in a place meant to repair what the war had broken. Then the nurses were escorted away, down a muddy path leading toward a holding area guarded by military police. As they walked, they looked back at the hospital one last time, understanding that they were leaving behind more than a camp. They were leaving behind a moment of clarity, a realization of what medicine could be, even in war. Their footsteps faded into the snow, but the memory stayed with them for years afterward. Some told their stories after the war, describing the night American medics treated their wounded with the same urgency and respect reserved for their own. Others kept the memory private, subdued by the weight of everything else they had endured. Yet the truth remained unchanged. In a world collapsing under the violence of total war, a small field hospital had shown that compassion could outlast ideology, and that the rules of humanity, when upheld even in darkness, created moments that would echo far beyond the battlefield. And from that quiet echo rises the final reflection, an understanding carried by those who witnessed the impossible become real. The wind carried a soft chill through the trees as the last of the German nurses disappeared toward the POW camp, leaving the field hospital behind them. The war would continue for months, grinding down armies, cities, and lives. But the memory they carried did not belong to destruction. It belonged to a fragile moment of clarity, one in which the rules of humanity held firm, even when everything else was falling apart. In the years that followed, history would reduce much of the Western Front to movements on a map, to arrows, divisions, offensives, and counters. But inside the minds of those nurses, a different narrative survived. They had seen the American medical system not as propaganda described it, not as the enemy depicted it, but as professionals working inside a machine built for endurance. They understood that success in medicine during war came not only from skill, but from structure, supplies that arrived on time, training that never ceased, leadership that valued organization over ideology. They remembered the stillness of the young German soldier waking after surgery he never expected to survive. They remembered the American medic's indifferent professionalism, treating him as a patient, not as a uniform. They remembered the surgeons who stood for hours without rest, not because of compassion alone, but because the system around them allowed compassion to function. And they remembered the quiet equality in those makeshift wards, where the boundaries of enemy and ally briefly dissolved under the universal need to save lives. War, they realized, exposes the worst of humanity, but it also reveals the structures that determine whether the best parts can still survive. The Americans had built a medical system that insisted on order over chaos, principle over rage. And in that system, even in the bitter winter of 1945, humanity found space to breathe. For the nurses, this memory did not erase the suffering they had witnessed on their own side. It did not rewrite the realities of a collapsing Reich or the consequences that followed. But it offered a quiet truth, one they carried into the post-war world as Germany rebuilt itself. That truth was simple, steady, and undeniable. Sometimes the clearest understanding of an enemy comes not from the battlefield, but from the moments when that enemy chooses to save a life they had every reason to abandon. And in those moments, history pauses long enough for humanity to speak.